The Galactic Council chamber floated in the silence of space, a massive ring of metal and glass orbiting the neutral planet far below. Inside, the air buzzed with 100 different languages, translated through devices that hung in the air like tiny silver birds. Representatives from across the known galaxy had gathered for the annual Strategic Defense Summit, and each one wanted to prove their strength. Do-yoon sat in the back corner of the enormous room and watched. He was a human diplomat in his mid-40s, with dark hair starting to gray at the temples and eyes that missed nothing. Next to him sat Hana, younger and sharper, her military uniform crisp and proper. On his other side was Jiho, an elderly scientific advisor who wrote notes on a tablet with steady hands. Their small station looked plain compared to the elaborate displays around them. The Vraxian Empire was presenting now. Their ambassador was a creature called Thexrel, standing nearly 3 meters tall with a body covered in chitinous armor that gleamed under the lights. Behind him, holographic projections showed massive warships bristling with weapons. The Vraxians had conquered 40 systems in the last decade alone. The other delegates murmured with what might have been respect or fear. When Thexrel finished, he turned and made a gesture toward the human delegation. His mandibles clicked in what the translation device rendered as laughter. Several nearby representatives looked at the humans and joined in the amusement. Do-yoon's expression did not change. He simply made a note on his tablet. The Kelthuran Dominion went next. They were a race of reptilian warriors, each one nearly as large as the Vraxians but covered in scales that shifted color with their moods. Their general, a scarred veteran named Six, displayed projections of occupied worlds and defeated enemies. When she spoke of military strength, her scales turned deep red with pride. She also glanced at the humans, and her mouth opened to show rows of sharp teeth. The translation device called it a smile, but it looked like hunger. Ambassador Soman of the Ethan Collective spoke after that. Her species had no solid form, existing instead as patterns of energy contained in specialized suits. Her voice came through speakers with a faint electric hum. She talked about the Council's need for strong defenders, for species that could contribute to galactic security. Then she gestured toward the human station and said something that made several delegations laugh openly. Hana's jaw tightened, but she did not speak. Jiho continued writing his notes. Do-yoon looked at Somin and nodded politely as if she had just commented on the weather. The presentations continued through the day. Species after species showed their military might, their conquered territories, their weapons that could crack planets or burn atmospheres. The displays grew more elaborate, more aggressive. Some delegations began arguing with each other over old disputes or new insults. The chamber filled with the sound of threats and counter-threats. Through it all, the 3 humans sat quietly in their corner. They did not interrupt. They did not argue. They took notes and occasionally whispered to each other in voices too low for the translation devices to catch. When the time came for Earth's delegation to present, Do-yoon stood slowly. The chamber quieted somewhat, though not with the respectful silence given to the major powers. It was more like the quiet before someone told a joke. Do-yoon walked to the center speaking platform, his footsteps echoing in the sudden hush. He looked around at the assembled delegates, at the hundreds of species watching him with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. Then he spoke in calm, measured tones. He thanked the Council for allowing humanity to observe. He said that Earth had only joined the galactic community 5 years ago and was still learning the customs and protocols. He stated that humanity preferred to listen and understand before contributing to these important discussions. Then he bowed slightly and returned to his seat. The entire presentation had taken less than 2 minutes. The chamber erupted in noise. The Vraxians hissed with laughter, their mandibles clicking rapidly. The Keltherans roared with what might have been mirth or mockery. Soman's energy form flickered with colors that the translation device labeled as amusement and disdain. Other delegates joined in, creating a wave of ridicule that washed over the human delegation. Hana's hands gripped the edge of their table, her knuckles white. Jiho reached over and patted her arm gently, his old eyes calm behind his glasses. Do-yoon sat down and resumed taking notes as if nothing had happened. But not everyone was laughing. In the highest tier of the chamber sat the eldest, three ancient beings whose species had founded the council millennia ago. They were so old that some believed they had been alive when their homeworld still had a sun. They watched the humans with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall. They did not laugh. They did not smile. They simply observed. And their silence was somehow louder than all the mockery around them. The session continued for hours more. As delegates presented their military capabilities and territorial claims, a pattern emerged. The strong mocked the weak. The conquerors dismissed the peaceful. Power was the only language that truly mattered in this chamber, and humanity had shown none. During a break, several delegates approached the human station. A Vraxian commander named Krelik loomed over Doyen's chair. He suggested, through his translator, that perhaps humans should remain in their small corner of space where they would be safe. The galaxy was dangerous, he said, and humanity clearly lacked the strength to defend themselves. Doyen looked up at the towering warrior and smiled politely. He thanked Krelik for his concern and assured him that humanity was quite comfortable with their current position. The Vraxian made a sound that might have been laughter or disgust and walked away. General 6 of the Keltherans came next, but with a different approach. She spoke quietly, suggesting that humanity might benefit from an alliance with the Dominion. They could offer protection, she said, in exchange for certain trade concessions and territorial access. Her scales shifted to a persuasive blue as she spoke. Hana started to respond, but Doyen raised a hand gently. He told 6 that humanity appreciated the offer but preferred to maintain neutrality for now. The general's scales flashed red for just a moment before returning to neutral green. She hissed something under her breath and left. As the day ended and delegates filed out of the chamber, conversations buzzed through the crowd. Many were about the humans and their weakness. Some species wondered why Earth had even been given a council seat. Others suggested that humanity would not last long in galactic politics. The three humans gathered their materials slowly, letting the crowd thin. Hana finally spoke, her voice tight with controlled anger. She asked Doyen why they had to endure such treatment. Why couldn't they show even a fraction of what Earth was capable of? Jiho answered before Doyen could. He said that rushing to prove strength often led to making enemies. Better to be underestimated than overestimated, he said. Better to be ignored than targeted. His voice was gentle but firm. Doyen added that they were learning valuable information. They were seeing how galactic powers truly behaved when they thought no one could challenge them. This knowledge, he said, would be useful later. Hana accepted this, though her expression showed she did not like it. The three of them left the chamber and walked through the station's corridors toward their ship. Behind them, the galaxy's powers continued their endless games of strength and dominance, never imagining that the quiet species in the back corner might be anything more than they appeared. 3 weeks had passed since the summit, and the threat everyone feared finally came true. The Vraxian Empire and the Keltheran Dominion went to war. The conflict started over mining colonies in the outer terminus sector. Worthless rocks that both sides claimed for reasons that had more to do with pride than resources. Within days, the fighting spread to neighboring systems. Within 2 weeks, hundreds of worlds stood in the path of destruction. The Galactic Council called an emergency session. Delegates rushed back to the orbital station, many arriving in military vessels instead of the usual diplomatic ships. The chamber that had been merely tense during the summit now crackled with genuine fear and anger. Doyen, Hana, and Jiho returned to their same corner station. They set up their equipment with the same quiet efficiency as before. This time they were joined by Minho, a younger advisor who had arrived on a civilian transport. He had sharp features and quick hands that constantly moved across his data tablet, monitoring streams of information that flowed too fast for most to follow. The session began with chaos. Thexerl of the Vraxian Empire stood before the council and declared that the Keltheran Dominion had violated ancient territorial agreements. He displayed evidence of Keltheran military movements, of colonies established in disputed zones, of provocations that could not be ignored. His voice boomed through the chamber, demanding that the council recognize Vraxian sovereignty and condemn the Dominion. General 6 responded with her own evidence, She showed records dating back centuries that proved Keltheran claims to the same systems. She displayed images of Vraxian aggression, of civilian ships destroyed, of colonies bombarded from orbit. Her scales shifted through angry reds and deep purples as she accused the Empire of war crimes. The chamber descended into shouting. Delegates took sides based on old alliances or new opportunities. Some species supported the Vraxians, drawn by promises of trade or protection. Others backed the Keltherans, hoping to gain favor with a potential victor. Smaller species tried desperately to remain neutral, while securing promises of safety for their own worlds. Through all of this, the human delegation sat quietly and watched. Doyen took notes with the same calm precision he had shown at the summit. Hana listened to the arguments with a military analyst's attention to detail. Jiho reviewed star charts and tactical data on his tablet. Minho's fingers never stopped moving across his screen, tracking something that only he could see. During the first recess, Krellick approached the human station with several other Vraxian warriors flanking him. He stood over Doyen's chair the same way he had before, but this time his tone was different. There was no mockery in his translated words, only a kind of dismissive warning. He told the humans that war was coming to this sector whether the council approved or not. The Vraxian military was mobilizing fully, bringing fleets that numbered in the thousands. He suggested that humanity should leave council space immediately and return to Earth. The galaxy was about to become very dangerous for species that could not defend themselves. Doyen looked up at the towering warrior and nodded slowly. He thanked Krellick for the warning and said that humanity would take his advice into consideration. The Vraxian made a huffing sound and walked away, his warriors following like shadows. Hana waited until they were gone before speaking in a low voice. She asked Doyen if he actually intended to withdraw. Doyen smiled slightly and shook his head. They were staying exactly where they were, he said. They had a job to do. The session resumed with no progress toward peace. If anything, positions had hardened. Both the Vraxians and Keltherans began issuing ultimatums. The council tried to mediate, but their words carried no weight against the reality of massive fleets already in motion. General Six approached the human delegation during the next break. Unlike Krellick, she came alone and spoke in what might have been a reasonable tone. Her scales showed calculated neutral colors as she made her proposal. She told Doyen that the Keltheran Dominion respected humanity's position as newcomers to galactic affairs. She said that the Dominion could offer protection to human colonies and trade routes in exchange for support in council votes. Not military support, she clarified, just diplomatic recognition of Keltheran territorial claims. The benefits would be substantial, she promised. Food shipments, technology transfers, guaranteed safety. Doyen listened carefully to every word. When Six finished, he asked several questions about specific systems, trade routes, and the civilian populations in the war zone. She answered most of them, though some responses seemed deliberately vague. Finally, Doyen thanked her for the offer and said that humanity needed time to consult with Earth before making such important decisions. Six's scales flashed red for a moment. The same anger response Hana had seen before. The general leaned closer, her voice dropping to a hiss that the translators barely caught. She told Doyen that neutrality would not protect Earth when the sector burned. Choosing no side was still a choice, she said, and it was the wrong one. Then she left, her tail sweeping across the floor in what might have been a gesture of frustration or threat. Minho looked up from his tablet after she was gone. He commented quietly that both sides were getting desperate if they were approaching humanity for support. Jiho agreed, noting that desperation made powerful species dangerous in unpredictable ways. The session continued through the day and into the night. Real-time feeds began showing the first major battles. Vraxian dreadnoughts engaged Keltheran destroyers in savage exchanges that lit up entire star systems. Civilian transports fled from border worlds, creating refugee streams that overwhelmed nearby stations. Smaller species began pulling their delegations from the council entirely, choosing to hide rather than risk being caught in the crossfire. Ambassador Somin of the Ethan Collective tried to organize a peacekeeping coalition. Her energy form flickered rapidly as she moved from delegation to delegation, trying to gather support. When she reached the human station, her colors were dim with exhaustion and stress. She explained that a coalition of smaller species wanted to create a buffer zone between the warring empires. They needed military support from anyone willing to provide it. She looked at Doyen with something that might have been hope or desperation. Doyen asked detailed questions about fleet positions, supply lines, and civilian evacuation routes. Soman provided what information she had, her form brightening slightly at his interest. Then Doyen told her that humanity would need to consult with Earth before committing any resources. They needed time to evaluate the situation properly. Soman's energy form flared bright with sudden anger. Her voice lost all diplomatic pretense as she accused humanity of cowardice and selfishness. The galaxy was burning, she said, and Earth was hiding behind bureaucratic delays. She called humans worse than useless, claiming they were parasites who took council benefits while contributing nothing in return. Other delegates who overheard this began nodding in agreement. The human delegation's reputation, already poor, sank even lower. Some species began openly questioning why humanity had been given council membership at all. Hana's face flushed with anger, but Doyen's expression remained calm. He simply thanked Soman for bringing the proposal and returned to his notes. The Ethon ambassador left in a storm of crackling energy. That evening, after the session ended, Hana met with Tejan in a secured room deep in the station. He was a human intelligence officer who had arrived quietly on an unmarked ship, carrying data chips encrypted with codes that only a handful of people knew. The information he showed Hana made her face go pale. The war was worse than the council knew. Both sides were moving planet-killer weapons into position. The fighting was about to shift from conventional warfare to something far more terrible. Civilian casualties were about to climb from thousands to billions. Hana brought this information to Doyen and Jiho immediately. They discussed it in voices too quiet for surveillance devices to catch. Minho joined them, explaining that the observers were in position and ready. They had been ready for weeks, he said. All they needed was authorization. Jiho expressed concern about revealing too much too soon. Once they showed their hand, he said, there would be no going back. The galaxy would never see humanity the same way again. Doyen sat in silence for a long moment, his face thoughtful. Then he said that the time for observation was ending. They had learned what they needed to know about galactic civilization. Now it was time to act. The next day, the council session opened with reports of escalating violence. Then came the news everyone feared. A Vraxian dreadnought was moving into position above a Keltheran colony world that held 3 billion civilians. Its planet-killer weapon was charging. The countdown had begun. The chamber erupted in panic and outrage. Delegates shouted at each other, at the Vraxians, at anyone who would listen. But no one had the military power to stop what was about to happen. The colony world had less than an hour before it died. Doyen stood slowly from his seat in the back corner. He raised his hand and requested permission to speak. Most delegates ignored him, too focused on the approaching catastrophe. But the eldest saw him standing there, and they recognized something in his posture. They called for silence. The council chamber fell completely silent when Doyen spoke those words. For a moment, no one moved. Then the laughter started. It began with a few delegates chuckling at what they thought was either a joke or delusion. Within seconds, it spread through the chamber like fire. Dexeral's mandibles clicked rapidly in what his translator rendered as mockery. He asked Doyen what exactly humanity thought they could do. The Vraxian dreadnought was one of the most powerful weapons in the galaxy. Did humans plan to fly there in their tiny merchant ships and ask politely for it to stop? General Six joined in with her own harsh laughter, her scales flashing with amused colors. She asked if perhaps humans had discovered some magical power during their 5 years in the council, or maybe they planned to use harsh words to disable the weapon. Even some of the smaller species who had remained neutral laughed nervously, releasing tension through humor. Ambassador Soman's energy form flickered with colors that translated to bitter amusement. She said something about humanity continuing to waste everyone's time with empty promises. Through all of this, Doyen remained standing. He did not look angry or embarrassed. He simply waited for the laughter to fade. Hana stood and activated her tablet. A holographic projection sprang to life in the center of the chamber, expanding until it filled the entire central space. Delegates who had been laughing suddenly stopped. Those who had been looking away turned to stare. Even the eldest leaned forward in their ancient seats. The projection showed the war zone in perfect detail. Every ship, Every weapon, every troop movement from both the Vraxian Empire and the Keltheran Dominion appeared on the display with crystal clarity. The resolution was far beyond anything the Council's sensors could achieve. It showed things that should have been impossible to detect. The chamber filled with confused murmurs. Several delegates began asking questions at once. How did humanity have this data? Where were their sensors? What technology was this? Hana spoke for the first time in a council session. Her voice was calm and professional, carrying the authority of a military officer giving a briefing. She explained that humanity had been monitoring the conflict since the first shots were fired. Their tracking systems had been watching both sides with complete accuracy. Before anyone could respond to this revelation, Minho activated additional displays around the chamber's perimeter. These new projections caused even the eldest to react with visible surprise. The displays showed space surrounding the war zone, regions that both empires considered secured. But they were not empty. Hundreds of vessels appeared on the projections, ships that no one had detected until this moment. They were massive, dark, and positioned in what should have been impossible locations. The ships bore no resemblance to any design in the galactic database. Their hulls seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. Their energy signatures were so minimal that they barely registered on any known sensor. They had been there for weeks, possibly longer, watching everything. A Vraxian commander in the chamber demanded to know what this meant. Were these human vessels? Was this some kind of trick or illusion? The projection had to be fake, he insisted. No fleet could hide like that. The Empire's sensors were the best in the galaxy. Jiho stood slowly, his old face gentle but his voice carrying unexpected weight. He explained that humanity had indeed developed somewhat different technology than the galactic standard. When Earth joined the Council, he said they made a conscious decision to observe and learn, before revealing their full capabilities. The chamber erupted in chaos. Delegates shouted over each other in dozens of languages that the translators struggled to keep up with. Some called it deception, others called it espionage. Many demanded explanations. How long had humans been watching? What else had they seen? What were their true intentions? A delegate from the Corvan hegemony accused humanity of violating council privacy laws. Another from the Thessian Combine demanded that Earth be expelled immediately for this breach of trust. General Six stood and declared that the Keltheran Dominion considered this surveillance an act of war. Thexeral agreed with his enemy for perhaps the first time in the conflict. He stated that the Vraxian Empire would not tolerate being spied upon by inferior species. His warriors in the chamber moved their hands closer to their weapons. Doyen raised his voice to be heard over the noise. He did not shout, but somehow his words cut through the chaos. He stated clearly that humanity had no territorial ambitions in this sector or anywhere else. They did not seek dominance or control. They had observed because observation was necessary to understand the reality of galactic politics. The chamber quieted somewhat as he continued. He said that what humanity had observed troubled them deeply. They had watched how the strong treated the weak. They had seen casual cruelty and systematic oppression accepted as normal. They had witnessed the glorification of conquest and the dismissal of life. But most importantly, he said, they had watched two civilizations slide toward genocide, while others stood by and did nothing. This, he declared, was something humanity could not and would not accept. He gave both the Vraxian Empire and the Keltheran Dominion 1 standard hour to stand down their planet-killer weapons and withdraw their forces to pre-war boundaries. If they did not comply, humanity would intervene directly. For a moment, the chamber was so silent that the hum of the station's life support systems could be heard. Then the silence shattered with furious responses from both warring parties. Krellick laughed, a harsh sound that needed no translation. He told Doyen that even if the human ships were real, they were outnumbered and outgunned. The Vraxian fleet numbered in the thousands with dreadnoughts that could crack worlds. What could a few hundred hidden ships do against such power? General Six agreed with her enemy again. She pointed out that humanity had no combat record, no proven weapons, no experience in warfare beyond their own primitive conflicts. The Keltheran Dominion had conquered civilizations and broken empires. Did the humans truly think they could challenge such might? Other delegates joined in with similar sentiments. Some suggested that the human ships were just surveillance vessels with no real weapons. Others claimed the entire display was an elaborate bluff designed to gain respect that humanity had not earned. A few even suggested that the humans were insane to threaten two of the galaxy's greatest military powers. Tajan, the intelligence officer, stepped forward. He spoke quietly, suggesting that both empires should reconsider their positions. He explained that humanity had been preparing for this moment since they first learned of the Council's existence. Every system they observed, every battle they studied, every weapon they analyzed had been part of a comprehensive learning process. He activated another display showing a single human vessel moving toward the Vraxian dreadnought that threatened the colony world. The ship had a designation painted on its dark hull in human letters that the translators could not render. It read simply as the Indomitable. The ship was accelerating toward the dreadnought at speeds that made several military observers in the chamber gasp. It was moving far faster than any capital ship should be able to manage. The dreadnought detected it and began turning its weapons toward this new threat. Minho provided real-time data as the projection showed the confrontation developing. The dreadnought had enough firepower to destroy a small moon. The human ship was half its size and completely alone. Every military expert in the chamber understood that this was suicide. Hana commented that humanity had watched the Vraxians long enough to understand their tactics and capabilities. They had studied Keltheran warfare extensively as well. In fact, she said, they had comprehensive data on every species' military systems and strategies. This knowledge, combined with their own developments, had led to some interesting conclusions about the nature of power. Doyen added that humanity had learned something important from their own bloody history. They learned that the true measure of strength was not the willingness to use violence but the capacity to prevent it. The greatest warriors, he said, were those who never had to fight because others knew better than to challenge them. On the projection, the Indomitable continued its approach to the dreadnought. The Vraxian vessel opened fire with everything it had. Energy weapons that could boil oceans converged on the small human ship. The Council watched, expecting to see it vaporized in an instant, but the projection showed something that made no sense to anyone watching. The human ship did not explode or evade. Instead, some kind of defensive field shimmered into existence around its hull. The Vraxian weapon struck the field and simply dissipated like rain hitting stone. The chamber filled with shocked silence. That kind of defensive technology did not exist in the galactic standard. Energy weapons were the ultimate ship killers precisely because shields could not stop them effectively. Yet the human vessel flew through the barrage without taking any visible damage. Then the Indomitable fired back. The Council watched as thin beams of light reached out from the human ship and touched the dreadnought with surgical precision. 30 seconds later, the Vraxian vessel went dark. Its weapons stopped firing. Its engines went offline. Its command system ceased responding. The ship was intact but completely helpless, floating dead in space. The hour that followed was the strangest in Galactic Council history. The projection in the center of the chamber continued showing events unfolding in real time across the war zone. Human vessels moved with a precision that seemed almost choreographed. They positioned themselves between fleets around civilian populations near strategic installations. Every movement appeared calculated to the smallest detail. Vraxian commanders tried everything to break through or around the human blockade. They sent fast attack craft on evasive patterns. They coordinated mass assaults from multiple angles. They attempted to overwhelm single human vessels with concentrated fire. Nothing worked. The human ships moved like they knew what the enemy would do before the enemy knew themselves. Every attack ended the same way, with Vraxian vessels going dark and floating helplessly in space. The Keltheran Dominion fared no better. General Six watched from the council chamber as her finest battle groups engaged the human fleet. Her scales cycled through colors that translated to frustration, anger, and finally something that might have been fear. Keltheran destroyers that had broken planetary defenses countless times found themselves disabled in seconds. Their crews reported that human weapons seemed to target specific systems with impossible accuracy. Thexerl stood at his delegation station, his entire body rigid with barely contained rage. He was receiving constant updates from Vraxian command. Each report was worse than the last. The Empire's mighty fleet, the force that had conquered 40 systems, was being systematically neutralized by an enemy they had mocked just hours ago. His mandibles clicked in patterns that the translators gave up trying to render into words. Ambassador Soman's energy form flickered erratically as she processed what she was witnessing. She had spent years studying galactic military capabilities for the Ethan Collective. She had analyzed every major power's strengths and weaknesses. Nothing in her research had prepared her for this. The humans were not just winning. They were winning without breaking a sweat, without suffering a single casualty, without even appearing to exert real effort. Delegates throughout the chamber watched the projections in stunned silence. Some recorded everything on their devices, though whether they would ever be allowed to share the recordings was unclear. Others sent urgent messages to their home governments. A few simply sat in shock, unable to process what they were seeing. Jiho remained seated at the human delegation station, his old hands folded calmly on the table. He had lived through many surprising moments in his long life, but this might have been the most satisfying. Years of careful planning and patient waiting were coming to fruition. He glanced at Doyen and saw the same calm determination that had sustained their mission from the beginning. Hana provided tactical commentary as events unfolded. She explained that human defensive technology worked on principles that galactic science had not fully explored. Their shields did not try to absorb or deflect energy, but instead redirected it through dimensional layers that made conventional weapons useless. Their targeting systems used predictive algorithms based on thousands of simulated battles and comprehensive data on enemy capabilities. A delegate from the Thessian Combine asked the question that many were thinking. If humanity had possessed this technology all along, why hide it? Why appear weak when they were clearly the strongest power in the galaxy? Minho answered this time. He explained that strength invited challenges. It created arms races and forced other species to view you as either an ally to cultivate or an enemy to destroy. Humanity wanted neither outcome. They wanted to observe and understand galactic civilization before deciding how to engage with it. He added that what humanity discovered troubled them greatly. They saw that in galactic politics might made right. Species with powerful militaries could do whatever they wished to weaker ones. The Council existed not to prevent such behavior, but to manage it and keep it from destabilizing trade routes or major powers. Justice and morality were concepts that received polite discussion, but little actual enforcement. Doyen stood and addressed the chamber. He said that humanity came from a world where they had nearly destroyed themselves multiple times through warfare and environmental collapse. They learned hard lessons about the difference between strength and wisdom. They developed technology not because they loved war, but because they feared it and wanted the power to prevent it. He gestured to the projection showing the frozen battle zone. He said that humanity had no desire to rule other species or expand their territory. Earth was sufficient for their needs. What they did want was a galaxy where genocide was not an acceptable method of conflict resolution, where civilian populations were not considered legitimate military targets, where peace meant more than just the temporary absence of war. The hour was nearly over. Thexerl received a communication that made his entire body sag slightly. The Vraxian High Command was requesting emergency talks with the human delegation. General Six received a similar message moments later from Keltheran leadership. Neither looked happy about it, but neither appeared willing to continue fighting an unwinnable war. Doyen invited both to approach the human station. They came reluctantly. These representatives of mighty empires, forced to negotiate from positions of complete weakness. Other delegates watched this reversal of fortune with expressions ranging from satisfaction to concern about what it meant for the broader balance of power. The negotiations were brief and blunt. Doyen stated humanity's terms clearly: complete ceasefire within the next 10 minutes. All planet-killer weapons to be withdrawn immediately and placed under neutral observation. Forces to return to pre-war boundaries. Humanitarian aid to be allowed through to all affected populations, regardless of which side controlled the territory. And finally, both sides to agree to formal peace talks mediated by neutral parties. Thexerl wanted to argue but found he had no leverage. His fleet was helpless. His weapons were useless. His empire's reputation for invincibility was shattered. He asked what would happen to the disabled Vraxian vessels and their crews. Hana assured him that all crew members were safe and would remain so. The moment both sides agreed to the ceasefire, human vessels would restore power to disabled ships and withdraw to observation positions. No one would be harmed or imprisoned. Humanity wanted peace, not prisoners. General Six asked the harder question. She wanted to know what would stop humanity from using this power to dominate the galaxy themselves. If humans could defeat both the Vraxians and Keltherans simultaneously, what prevented them from conquering everyone? Jiho answered this time. He said that humanity had dominated their own planet once, during their darker periods of history. They knew where that path led. Domination required constant enforcement. It bred resentment and rebellion. It turned strength into weakness by making enemies of everyone. Humans had learned, painfully and slowly, that true security came not from controlling others but from making control unnecessary. He added that humanity would maintain their fleet presence in strategic locations to prevent future genocides or similar atrocities. But they would not interfere in normal political disputes, territorial negotiations, or economic competitions. They were not interested in running the galaxy, only in ensuring that civilizations were not exterminated for convenience. The ceasefire began exactly at the 1-hour mark. Across the war zone, weapons went silent. Human vessels began restoring power to disabled ships as promised. Vraxian and Keltheran crews found their systems coming back online with no damage and no sign of sabotage. They were simply allowed to go back to their pre-war positions without further conflict. The council chamber slowly came back to life as delegates began processing what had just happened. Conversations started quietly and built to a dull roar of discussion and debate. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted fundamentally in a single hour. Everyone was trying to understand what it meant for their own species and interests. Ambassador Soman approached the human delegation station. Her energy form showed colors that the translator rendered as confusion mixed with grudging respect. She asked Doyen why humanity had acted to save the Keltheran colony. Humans had no direct interest in that system. They owed nothing to the Keltherans, who had mocked them repeatedly. Doyen looked at her with calm eyes and said that humanity did not help based on who deserved it or who had been kind to them. They helped because 3 billion living beings were about to die for no good reason. That was enough. The species of those beings, their government, their past actions toward Earth, none of that mattered when faced with genocide. Soman's form flickered with colors the translator could not identify. She was silent for a long moment before speaking again. She said that the Ethan Collective had misjudged humanity badly. She apologized for her earlier harsh words and asked if there might be a way to begin again on better terms. Doyen smiled slightly and said that humanity had never held grudges over words spoken in ignorance. They understood that they had deliberately appeared weak and could not blame others for believing the appearance. But yes, he said, there was always room for better understanding between species willing to try. Other delegates began approaching the human station with similar sentiments. Some offered apologies for their mockery. The days following the ceasefire were filled with tense negotiations. Doyen, Hana, and Jiho worked alongside neutral mediators from several smaller species to facilitate discussions between the Vraxian Empire and Keltharan Dominion. The talks took place in a secured section of the council station, with human vessels maintaining a quiet but visible presence throughout the war zone. Both empires struggled with the new reality. Thexrel arrived at negotiations with a delegation of Vraxian military commanders who looked at the humans with barely concealed resentment. They were warriors who had never known defeat, and the humiliation of being disabled so completely stung worse than any physical wound. Yet they came to the table because they had no other choice. General Six brought her own team of hardened Keltheran officers. Her scales showed more controlled colors now. Less of the aggressive reds and purples, more subdued greens and blues. She had reviewed every second of the recorded engagements with human vessels. Her analysts had concluded what she already suspected. The Dominion could not win against humanity. Not now, not in 10 years, probably not in 100 years. The technology gap was simply too vast. The negotiations were slow and painful. Both sides had grievances going back generations. Territory disputes that predated most species membership in the council. Cultural insults that had festered for decades. military incidents that each side remembered differently. Hana sat through these sessions taking notes and occasionally providing factual corrections when either side exaggerated their claims. Minho monitored the situation across the war zone, tracking compliance with the ceasefire terms. Both empires were honoring the agreement so far, though occasional incidents required human intervention. A Vraxian patrol that strayed too close to Keltheran space found itself gently but firmly redirected by a human vessel. A Keltheran supply convoy that tried to establish a forward base in disputed territory was politely informed that the base would not be allowed and should be dismantled. The human presence was constant but not oppressive. They did not demand changes to government or culture. They did not confiscate weapons or occupy territory. They simply enforced the ceasefire and ensured that humanitarian aid reached populations in need. This restraint surprised many observers who expected conquerors to behave like conquerors. Taijin worked behind the scenes with intelligence services from both empires. They wanted to understand human capabilities better, to learn if there were any weaknesses they could exploit. He shared some information freely while keeping other secrets secure. He explained that human defensive shields worked by redirecting energy through higher dimensional spaces. He did not explain exactly how humans had discovered and learned to manipulate those spaces. After 2 weeks of negotiations, the basic framework of a peace agreement began to emerge. The disputed mining colonies would be placed under neutral administration for 5 years, while both sides worked on a permanent solution. Reparations would be paid by both empires to affected civilian populations. Prisoner exchanges would begin immediately. Most importantly, both sides agreed to establish formal diplomatic channels to resolve future disputes before they escalated to violence. It was not perfect, and no one pretended it was. Centuries of animosity could not be erased in a few weeks of talks, but it was a start, and sometimes a start was all you could hope for. The Galactic Council reconvened for a formal session to ratify the peace agreement. The chamber was packed with delegates eager to witness this historic moment. The atmosphere was completely different from the last full session. Where before there had been mockery and dismissal of the human delegation, now there was careful respect and obvious caution. Doyen stood before the council to address them one final time before the vote. He spoke in the same calm tones he had used from the beginning, but now everyone listened carefully to every word. He thanked the mediators who had worked tirelessly to find common ground between enemies. He acknowledged the courage it took for both the Vraxians and Keltherans to set aside pride and negotiate in good faith. Then he addressed the broader issue that everyone was thinking about. He said that humanity understood their intervention had raised questions about their intentions and role in galactic affairs. Many species were concerned about what human power meant for the existing balance and structure of civilization. Jiho stood and continued the explanation. He said that humanity would maintain their fleet presence in strategic locations throughout Council space. They would monitor situations that might escalate to genocide or similar atrocities. They would intervene when necessary to prevent the destruction of civilizations. But they would not seek to govern, would not demand tribute, would not impose human values or culture on others. Hana added that humanity recognized they could not police the entire galaxy even if they wanted to. They did not have unlimited resources or the desire to become the galaxy's permanent enforcement mechanism. What they hoped was that their demonstration would serve as a deterrent. That species would think twice before attempting genocide when they knew humanity might respond. She said that over time, humanity hoped to share some of their technology with species that showed they could be trusted with it. Not weapons, but defensive systems, medical advances, energy production methods. The goal was to raise the overall level of capability so that species could defend themselves and help each other, rather than relying on human intervention. Ambassador. Someone asked if humanity intended to join the Council permanently, or if they planned to remain as outside observers. Her energy form showed genuine curiosity, rather than the hostility she had displayed before. This was a fair question that many delegates wanted answered. Doyen replied that humanity would remain as active council members. They would participate in debates, vote on issues, and work toward improving galactic civilization from within the existing structure. They believed the council had potential to be a genuine force for good, if member species chose to make it so. Humanity wanted to be part of that effort. A delegate from the Corvin hegemony, who had been one of the loudest critics of human deception, stood to ask another question. He wanted to know how other species could trust humanity, now that they knew humans were capable of such deception. If humans could hide their true strength for 5 years, what else might they be hiding? Jiho acknowledged this was a legitimate concern. He said that trust had to be earned through consistent action over time. Humanity could make promises, but words were cheap. They would demonstrate their intentions through behavior, through restraint in using power, through keeping commitments even when it was inconvenient. He added that humanity's initial deception had been necessary for exactly this reason. If they had arrived showing their full capabilities, every species would have seen them as either a threat to be destroyed or an ally to be courted for selfish reasons. By appearing weak, humans were able to see how galactic civilization truly functioned when dealing with those who could not defend themselves. The results, he said quietly, had been instructive. The vote on the peace agreement was unanimous. Even the Vraxians and Keltherans voted for it, recognizing they had no better options. The war that had threatened to consume the sector was officially over. Reconstruction could begin. Refugees could return home. Life could start to return to normal. After the session ended, many delegates approached the human station. Some offered formal diplomatic recognition and proposed establishing embassies on Earth. Others suggested joint research initiatives or cultural exchanges. A few simply wanted to talk, to understand these mysterious humans better. Krellick came to speak with Doyon one last time. The Vraxian warrior looked different now, less arrogant, more thoughtful. He said that he had underestimated humanity badly, and that this mistake would haunt him for the rest of his life. He asked if Doyon thought the Vraxians could ever regain their former reputation. Doyon considered this carefully before answering. He said that reputation based on fear and conquest was ultimately fragile. True respect came from how species treated others, how they behaved when they had power over the weak. The Vraxians had a chance now to build a different kind of reputation if they chose to take it. That choice, he said, was theirs to make. General Six had a similar conversation with Hana. The Keltheran general admitted that she had been prepared to die rather than surrender to the Vraxians. The intervention had saved not just Keltheran civilians, but also prevented her from making choices she would have regretted. She asked if humanity would be willing to train Keltheran forces in defensive technologies, not for conquest, but for genuine security. Hana said she would relay the request to Earth Command. She could not make promises, but she thought there might be possibilities for cooperation if the Dominion was serious about changing its approach to galactic relations. Six's scales showed colors that translated to hope and determination. The eldest summoned Doyon for one final private conversation before the human delegation departed the station. They spoke of larger patterns and longer timescales than most species considered. They said that in their long existence, they had seen civilizations rise with great promise only to fall into the trap of believing that might made right. They had watched the cycle repeat countless times.